Good morning, perhaps good afternoon, good evening, and perhaps even hello tomorrow. I'm so happy to welcome you today for our program, The Fragment Transformed. I am Mary Miller, Director of the GRI, that is to say the Getty Research Institute, one of 4 programs on the Getty Center campus. Here in Southern California, it is just 10:30 a.m. And in Los Angeles, I stand here on traditional Tongva and Gabrieleño lands. We need to live in this world with awareness of where we are and who has come before us. We're happy to have joining us today an engaged community from around the world, from Bhutan and Mexico, the UK, Australia, and more. And a warm greeting to those of you who watch this program later in replay. We're grateful to all of you for your interest and to and we're happy to have you here at our enthusiastic panel today. This program is part of the Scholar Year, the Fragment, which is intended along the way to have programs that launch conversations that will provoke new questions in art history and visual culture. I'm about to turn this program over to Alexa Sakura, head of the Scholars Program. I just want to say that the Scholars Program has welcomed its class this fall in the past 2 weeks, and it's been fantastic to have this record number of scholars on site and here with us at the Getty Center and at the Getty Villa this year. This is our 2nd year of study and exploration of the fragment, a noun that for many of us, we now understand after 19 months of the pandemic in new ways. I turn it over to you, Alexa.
Thank you very much, Mary. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Alexa Sakura, head of the Scholars Program here at the Getty Research Institute. As many of you will know, each year we accept scholars from around the world to pursue research based on an annual theme. Last year and this year, the theme has been the fragment, considering the various ways that fragments and fragmentation have been treated, understood, and interpreted within the realm of art and art history. Like our previous panels on society, narratives, and archaeology last year, today's panel had been conceived and organized by Thisbe Gensler and Rose Campbell. Today's panel will consider the manifold ways that artists have reimagined and repurposed fragments to tell new stories and challenge established traditions. Our speakers today are Brian Partel, Catherine Baruch, and Natasha Bissonauth from the chunk aesthetics of assemblage in the 1960s to the use of pilgrimage souvenirs to make contemporary art pieces. Fragments of both fine art objects and discarded trash have been reassembled and recast as expressions of creativity, resistance, and power. With case study that include the queering of traditional heteropatriarchal narratives through digital collage, these talks will explore how fragments are transformed and reinterpreted to offer critique of culture, race, and gender. There will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions after the final presentation, but please feel free to write your questions into the Q&A box throughout the event. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Pietro Rigolo. Pietro is Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary Collections here at the Getty Research Institute. And we are very pleased to have him as our moderator today. Pietro, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Alexa, and good morning, everybody, and welcome. I am Pietro Rigolo, and I will be moderating the panel today. And so before I start with introducing our first presenter, actually, I wanted to thank my colleagues, Rose Campbell and Thisbe Gensler, for developing the idea, inviting the panelists, and asking me to moderate. They really did all the work, actually. So we will have 3 presentations of about 15 minutes each, followed by a Q&A. And as Alexa already said, please feel free to drop your question throughout the program, and I'll make sure to get to them during our Q&A. So let's start with introducing our first presenter, Brian Bartel. Brian is a faculty member at the Arts Center College of Design, where he teaches courses on modernity, modernism, media studies, and race and technology studies in the Humanities and Sciences department. He is currently writing a book titled On the Eve of the Cybercultural Revolution, Black Power and Racial Capitalism in the 1960s. His talk today is entitled Noa Purifoy, Junk and the Cybercultural Era. Brian, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. So today I'll be talking about Noa Purifoy's junk assemblage sculpture in aesthetic theory, especially his essay, The Art of Communication as a Creative Act, from the 66 Signs of Neon exhibition, first put on in 1966, alongside James and Grace Lee Boggs' political theory from the 1960s, or what they called the cybercultural era, and with a few words in transition about the California State McCone report on the 1965 Watts Rebellion. Doing this in order to think about what Purifoy called junk in relation to questions of technology change, processes of racialization, but especially the Boggs and Purifoy's shared interest in value and thinking against the racial capitalist logic of value production at a time in which, in the United States at least, the automation discourse was just as prominent as it is today. I want to thank Bisbee Gensler and Rose Campbell for inviting me to speak today on how material and conceptual fragments offer ways of rethinking narratives in historical contexts. And Purifoy's work is especially open to this, both in terms of the multiple art historical context that it can be put in relationship to, but especially because his mode of theorizing focused on the transformative potential of the viewer's own interaction with his work, and also in the creative process of production instead of the final work of art. Next slide, please. This is an image of Purifoy at the 66 Signs of Neon exhibition in Berkeley in 1967. Next slide, and I'll come back to that. This is from his Join for the Art scrapbook, which you can find on the Archives of American Art websites. Join for the Arts was the umbrella organization that he set up in order to put on the 66 Signs of Neon exhibition. And then next slide. And then this is the scrapbook page, and we see that first image in the middle, and I'll just leave this one up for now. So much of the writing about 66 Signs of Neon focuses on the relationship between the sculptures, which were made with former commodities that were damaged and destroyed in the August of 1965 rebellion, which Purifoy, other artists at the Watts Tower Art Center, and kids from Watts collected in the aftermath of the rebellion and turned into 66 revolving sculptures, which first toured California, ultimately Germany in 1972, before being returned to Purifoy in such a damaged state that he threw them away. So they don't really exist anymore for the most part. These sculptures were a testing ground for his theories about the creative process, the ways that the use of junk, which as Kelly Jones has written, was, quote, democratic, it didn't discriminate, could be used to challenge the ways that especially Black people in Watts, though his project also sought much wider change, might create alternative forms of value, and the ways that junk sculpture could create spaces outside of normal circumstances, as he said, which could produce new forms of communication, which is partly to say that Purifoy's mode of theorizing his own work invites contextualization and recontextualization. Next slide, please. Two examples of this. This is Sir Watts, now lost, the most iconic of the sculptures, which looks like medieval armor, which has this chest of pins, silverware, other items covered by plastic. There are wooden drawers at the bottom. Again, Kelly Jones has described this as representing people in battle and a figure simply of want and love and care, thinking about the post-Watts reparative work that his sculpture and art practice sought to address. And then I'll come back to this image at the close of my talk. Next image, please. This is the cover of the 66 Signs of Neon exhibition catalog, entitled Breath of Fresh Air, which refers both to the collage and the sculpture in the foreground, thinking about the transformation of normal circumstances here. And while most often focus in scholarship is placed on the immediate events of the rebellion in relation to 66 Signs of Neon, as Purifoy wrote, Watts finds itself virtually set down in the center of junk piled high on all sides, thinking about this image. Its main industry is junk. The essential question being posed to the community by the exhibit was, what is the true value of these materials over and above sale to junkyards for a few cents? For Purefoy, there's this relationship between junk and racialized social differentiation, and also the ways that junk is central to the political economy of Watts. In the catalog, he refers to himself as a member of the community of junkers, people who earn a living in the informal economy of collecting and selling junk. And it should be noted that this informal economy existed in the shadows of the nearby aerospace industries in Los Angeles, right? In the Cold War, Los Angeles was the heart of the aerospace industry, and these jobs were unavailable to Black residents of Watts because of racist hiring practices. So in this context, we see the high and the low next to each other, right? The jarring juxtaposition of normal circumstances in the capitalist geography of Los Angeles. And in the art of communication, Purefoy referred to all of these circumstances, consumerism, commodification, racial inequality, as the materialistic world that he sought to remake. And this takes me to the heart of what I'm interested in Purefoy in relation to junk and the economy and Watts in the space age. I believe that new perspectives on Purefoy's sense of junk and transforming the materialistic world can be opened by placing that in relation to the under-discussed, and perhaps from our perspective of 2021, we might say the conceptual fragments from Black power political economy of the 1960s, and especially the work of James and Grace Lee Boggs, which was closely connected to the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. and Huey Newton, others from the period, who focused on the historical relationship between technology change and the production of racial difference, and then understood the 1960s as a moment of both constitutional crisis around civil rights and legal equality, as well as struggles over economic equality, how capital and labor were being reorganized, in part due to automation at the time, and thinking about this reorganization of labor and capital in ways that didn't become fully sort of blown until the 1970s, right? And thinking about alternative ways of organizing against this reorganization. Purefoy's own text points to the technopolitics of this moment, when he wrote that the motivation for the exhibition wasn't the Watts Rebellion itself, but instead the publication of the official California State report on the rebellion, Violence in the City, an end or a beginning, or it is, as it is best known, the McCone Report, after its lead author, former CIA director, John A. McCone. And the McCone Report is very important in the historiography of the Watts Rebellion, but isn't discussed much in relation to Purefoy. Next slide, please. And then next slide, we'll skip this one. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, thank you. So this is just the cover and the table of contents of the McCone Report. And a lot can be said about this, the report. Critics then and now have discussed the ways that it embraced a Moynihan report like culture of poverty thesis that argued that Black leaders need to, quote, shoulder their full share of responsibility, both for the events of the rebellion and then what was to come after. It did call for Keynesian era investment in education, but education that should focus on, quote, attitudinal training where necessary to help Black children in Watts develop the necessary motivation, certain basic principles of conduct, and essential communication skills, all of which are necessary for success, end quote, in the white world of productive labor. So when Purefoy writes about art education and communication outside of normal circumstances, he's critiquing this sense of education. The McCone Report was ordered to do a number of things, but especially to come up with a timeline of the events, both the events of August 11th to the 16th, which I could say more about in the Q&A, but also the relationship of those events to the larger sense of the US space age, which it feared a pathologized Watts had interrupted. Quote, of what shall it avail our nation if we can place a man on the moon, but cannot cure the sickness of our cities? The report's linear trajectory of unfreedom in the US space age is part of a larger technological narrative in which Black migration from the South to Watts was specifically the result, as it understood it, of mechanization. As it said, modern methods and mechanization of the farm have dramatically, and in some regards sadly, reduced the need for the farmhand. With this, a drift to the city was an inevitable and necessary result, and that the jobs that were found upon arriving in Watts were now disappearing because of mechanization or automation, and as automation industry took over, wiping out one task after the other, as it wrote. Now, the McCone Report, again, was not alone in thinking about automation and mechanization, which were often synonyms at the time. For instance, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson set up the National Commission on Technology, Automation, and Economic Progress. Now, unlike the McCone Report's normative model of a disrupted linear trajectory of technological progress at the time, for James and Grace Lee Boggs, the then president of Watts in the United States should be seen as a continual interrelationship between technology change, the production of racial difference, dating to the organization of life in plantation slavery, the invention of the cotton gin in response to forms of resistance, in terms of the forms of dispossession, which motivated the implementation of farm mechanization. And where at key moments in this history, there are re-articulations of social categories and political possibilities. One of these moments of re-articulation being the cybercultural era. Next image, please. These are just some covers of their books, The American Revolution from 1963. Next image. The Manifesto for a Black Revolutionary Party from 1969. And the next image. This is Racism and Class Struggle from 1970, a collection of essays, and I'll be reading, talking about these. And these are attributed to James Boggs, so they were co-authored together, and I can say more about their relationship in the Q&A. From the essay, The Myth and Irrationality of Black Capitalism. The physical structure and environment of the Black community is underdeveloped, not because it has never been at a stage of high industrial development, but because it has been devastated by the wear and tear of constant use of the industrial development of this country. Scientifically speaking, the physical undevelopment of Black community is decay. Black communities are used communities, the end result and aftermath of rapid economic development. Following the Boggses, we should see Purefoy's community of junkers as working in this world of undevelopment, in which junk is the result not only of the rebellion, but of a longer history in which Black labor power and people are reused in the process of capitalist overproduction, which leads to junk. But the cybercultural era was again one of contradictory political possibilities, of which the Watts Rebellion was one significant moment in both the reorganization of social relations and how that might be organized alternatively and towards different ends than attitudinal trading and outmoded jobs. From the Manifesto for a Black Revolutionary Party, they wrote, "These urban rebellions heralded the emergence of a new social force inside the Black community itself, the street force of Black youth. This force is made up of a new generation of young Blacks who in the past would have been integrated into the American economy in the traditional role of unskilled and menial labor. Now they have been rendered obsolete by the technological revolutions of automation and cybernation, driven into the military, the prisons, and the streets, outcasts, castaways, cast off. They are without any future except that which Black power can create for them. Automation and cybernation have made them expendable to the economy, but they have also liberated Blacks for the first time in their history on this continent from the necessity to work on behalf of white development. So there's this contradiction between expendability and liberation. For the Boggses, the goals of the civil rights movement for Black integration into a capitalist economy on an equal basis with white workers was out of sync with actual economic development. But even more importantly, they critique programs like the McCone Report, which sought to educate the children of Watts specifically for those jobs that would no longer exist, or in John Maynard Keynes's language, for technological unemployment, though the Boggses and Keynes have very different sense of this. Unlike today, the Boggs didn't fetishize STEM-focused education as the answer to keeping up with the accelerations in capitalist technological unemployment. Not that they were against education in the sciences, far from it, they wrote extensively about it. Instead, education was to be part of a broader Black power project that would transform human being in the world. Scientific Black power, which they termed their movement as an alternative to cultural nationalist versions, would institute universal healthcare, would reorganize the city around public transportation and walking specifically, would call for social housing and social property. And they were based in Detroit, and James Boggs was was part of the Great Migration, moving from Alabama to work in the auto industry, which he did until the 1970s. And Grace Lee was from New York City, but they were working in Detroit and really thinking about changes in the Detroit economy specifically here, though they imagined this to be effective across the United States. They also argued that scientific Black power should challenge environmental racism, a movement that they became more and more involved with into the 1980s, and Grace Lee only died a couple of years ago. But they argued especially that scientific Black power would reorient society away from its focus on production for production's sake and unending economic growth. The Boggses argued that automation, industrialization, past labor, and especially past Black labor had created a society of abundance and laid the foundation for a world in which constant labor to produce capital and surplus value was unnecessary. And I'm wrapping up here. Their political project sought to repair historic racialized inequalities for a society of abundance, although one which also required consuming less so as not to destroy the planet. The challenge was that this would necessarily require revolution of values, especially those values which equated full humanity with productive labor, and full humanity itself was defined in terms of racial and gendered inequality. As they wrote in a language parallel to Purifoy's in the American Revolution, now that man is being eliminated from the productive process, a new standard of value must be found. This can only be man's value as a human being. So they want to replace this laborist productivist ideology with what they called socially necessary activity. They gave examples of this as social services, care work, urban agriculture projects, those activities which fall under the category of social reproduction, and especially, as they said many times, education and other forms of establishing relations between man and man, again in Purifoy's language. The future world that they fought and struggled for was never arrived, or more accurately was defeated by capitalist counter-revolution, in which there's been geographic reorganization of production. Those technological possibilities have been reordered towards targeted ads, right? Predictive policing, automated debt collection, those self-checkout lines at the grocery stores. But again, concluding by returning to Purifoy, in our techno-present, contextualizing Purifoy in relation to the cybercultural moment in Black power thought, I think is particularly generative because it invites consideration of the often contradictory nature of capitalist economies, the simultaneity or always contradictory nature, the simultaneity of undevelopment and high-tech ideologies, the emphases on productive labor, the need for alternative systems of value and care, which are attendant to the ways that inequality is not an effect, but constitutive of our normal circumstances. And then next slide, please. This is, I think, maybe best brought out in Purifoy's 1996 remake on the right here of Sir Watts, in which the figure of rapid undevelopment in want of care is now a figure produced and discarded by the high-tech economy, a cyborg-like figure who is perhaps programmed for obsolescence and in need of new forms of value. And then the final slide, next, please. This is one of Purifoy's last assemblages called Bessemer Steel in Joshua Tree, California, referring to the industrial town in Alabama where he grew up near there. His family worked in its steel factories, which were named for Henry Bessemer, who invented a process for steel production in the 19th century. A town James Boggs went to high school in, a town the Black assemblage artist Thornton Dial was from as well. And this sculpture also seeks to reevaluate industrial modernity, asking the viewer through their engagement with it to think about the histories of Black labor, the factory labor process, technology, attempts to organize life through undevelopment, and how these fragments might be put back together into a fuller narrative of racial capitalism in US history. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, for this fascinating presentation, and I'm looking forward to discuss in the Q&A. Just a reminder for everybody, just feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat, and for Brian as well as for the other presenters that will present right now. And it's now my pleasure to present our second speaker, Catherine Baruch. Catherine is Associate Professor and Thomas E. Bertelsen Jr. Chair of Art History and Religion at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and Santa Clara University. Her second book, Imaging Pilgrimage, Art as Embodied Experience, was published by Bloomsbury in August 2021. And her talk today is entitled Assemblage as a Pilgrimage Portal, the Afterlife of the Found Object. Catherine, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Thank you to Pietro, Rose, and Thisbe, and to all the folks behind the scenes who made this panel possible today. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is the interior of the Shrine of Our Lady of Montserrat, not far from Barcelona, nestled in a sacred mountain. The enthroned Madonna is of indeterminate origins and attached to many legends and oral histories. Some say that the image was carved by St. Luke during biblical times and then carried to Spain. It is also the site of many professed miracles and attracts over 1 million pilgrims a year. Next slide, please. I took the previous photo while on Camino with 12 grad students and then spent several more years interviewing folks about their experiences when encountering images like this. I can share that they seem to, we can actually go back. Can we just go back to the Black Madonna for a moment? Yeah, I could share that they seem to hold in common a shared sense of not only the quote unquote real presence of Mary, as several described, but also, and this is key, a perceived connection to all the people who had encountered the image in the past and all those who will come in the future. This talk today will focus not on holy sites themselves, but the things collected from them and their perceived efficacy as they become part of ritual assemblage. In my work, I've borrowed from Edith and Victor Turner's notion of communitas, but rather than thinking about the community formed by a group of pilgrims, I'm more interested in how objects can function as a site of community by connecting those who have encountered them in the past and those who will in the future. In this way, the notion can take on an extra temporal sort of dimension. The Marian image at Montserrat in this way becomes a symbol vehicle, and so do the souvenirs that are taken away from these sites. We can go to the next slide now, please. Thank you. Great. So compatible with this expanded notion of extratemporal communitas, recent scholarship in the field of medieval studies has established the importance of the agency of objects collected from holy sites. For example, pilgrimage badges and souvenirs, and their ability to engender an embodied experience for their apotropaic and talismanic capacities. Megan Foster Campbell has written about lead and tin pilgrimage badges that were collected as souvenirs from sacred locations and later sewn onto the pages of illuminated devotional books, as you see here. She describes the function of these as an aid for personal devotion beyond the temporal and physical experience of a pilgrimage journey, facilitated by mental or virtual pilgrimage for the book owner through memory or imagination, perhaps particularly relevant in this time of pandemic. At the next slide, please. So I'm shifting the focus from the Middle Ages to the present today in order to critically examine contemporary art that incorporates fragments of holy sites, souvenirs, water, photographs, with the intention of engendering a multivalent viewing experience. The work I'm going to introduce challenges the, quote, strange place of religion in contemporary art by drawing on religious practice across traditions and taking it seriously, namely indigenous Quechua culture and the syncretic Catholicism of Southern Italy, respectively. Next slide, please. So third-class relics that you're looking at here still form a robust aspect of Catholic popular piety. This is the belief that fragments of cloth, pilgrimage badges, as I just showed you, cards that you can see here, or other objects that come into the contact with the body of a saint are imbued with a trace of the sacredness of that person. Sometimes this also translates to holy sites. It is not unusual to find boxes with fragments of dust and stone from the Holy Land. These practices have roots in the ancient world and were encouraged in patristic writing. Gregory, Eusebius, and Augustine all discuss third-class relics in the form of filings from St. Peter's chains, oil, and flowers from the Holy Land, respectively. In her comprehensive essay on the origin of these third-class relics, Julia Smith has highlighted the tension between spontaneous and officialized veneration. So today, the artists' work who I will focus on are Gisela Ensuaste and Chiara Ambrosio. Both women are influenced by Catholic devotional objects, although it is a syncretic and enculturated Catholicism, and work in multimedia, including assemblages of souvenirs, sacred objects, and installations. Ensuaste has been awarded the Smithsonian LMSP Fellowship, the McDowell Colony Fellowship, the Artadia D House Award, and has exhibited works at various institutions and galleries, including the Bronx Museum of Art, El Museo del Barrio in New York, and the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art. Ambrosio has undertaken major commissions from the Victoria and Albert Museum, collaborated with the composer Michael Nyman, and has exhibited at the Whitechapel Gallery in London and Anthology Film Archives in New York City. She is also the recent recipient of a major AHRC award for her second feature film. Nswaste and Ambrosio incorporate both ritual practice and ritual objects into their work in order to create an embodied experience for others, which can be applied to the medieval framework of surrogate, or as Leila Karst has put it, translated pilgrimage through material culture, fragments, and specifically assemblage. One of the materials engaged by Nswaste is a jar of water collected from Montserrat, the home of the Black Madonna that I introduced a moment ago. It is an art that both draws on stories and shapes them. We can go to the next slide, please. I first encountered Nswaste's work by way of an installation on an old blue bus parked on San Pablo Avenue in Berkeley, California, called Making Marks Again. I entered the bus through the back doors, auguries into an embodied experience. And we can go to the next slide. The seats were removed and the ceiling was crisscrossed with strands of color tape in geometric forms. Completing the sort of mini pilgrimage down the bus, I eventually arrived at a dashboard altarcito, and we can go to the next slide, please. Hopefully. Great. Okay, so this is the bus with the this is the you can see how the seats are removed, and you're looking at the back door of the bus. And then if we could just go to the next one, that would be great. Okay, so this is a little dashboard on a little altarcito dashboard containing a number of personal effects: a black and white photo of a smiling couple on the Lower East Side of New York City, a jar of holy water from the sacred mountain of Montserrat, moss, and Ecuadorian textiles. And then if we could just go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Nswaste first encountered the bus in a darkened garage in San Leandro. And when her camera flashed, she noticed the cracks and indeed carvings in the window, which formed the starting point of the matrices of tape that you saw on the ceiling. The bus was from the mid-1980s and has had 3 distinct prior lives. It was first a prison transport vehicle in Santa Clara, California, before being used to convey festival goers to Burning Man in the Nevada desert. Finally, it was donated to Unexpected Projects, a mobile public and community gallery curated by Jen Stager and Jenny Solomon. We could just go to the next slide, please. For Nswaste, the marks from the passengers in the windows were abstracted and exaggerated. She describes the project as being about the traces, marks, markings, fragments that we leave behind, and how they connect to our past and our current places and spaces. Can we go to the previous slide just with a tape, if you can? Yeah, so the crisscrosses of tape are an abstraction of the literalness of the collection of the personal souvenirs on the dashboard. Both form an example of what I'm calling an extratemporal communitas. So according to Victor Turner, communitas is enacted when lowliness and sacredness are combined in what he calls a moment in and out of time. The dashboard installation encapsulates this with its collection of personal items and sacred objects. We could just go to the altarcito again, the next slide. Invoking taxis and buses in Latin America and Asia and among immigrant communities across the US. An altarcito, or a little altar, is a place of memory and connection in Catholic Latinx popular piety. Making one is a sacramental practice. It is inherently connected to the sacrifice at the big altar, a place of ritual remembrance where during Mass, Catholics behold a relic of the body of Christ in the form of a consecrated host. Like a medieval psalter augmented with sewn pilgrimage badges, or as Catherine Rudy has shown, actual Eucharistic hosts, the bust installation links to the past, but also to an imagined future. This occurs both in the abstracted and geometric tape matrices, which Nswaste links to walking and embodied movement, procession, and pilgrimage, as well as more literally in the souvenir objects collected from sacred sites and assembled here. One is precise, modern, colorful. The other is messy, ritualistic, organic, and both work together to activate the space as a place where communitas could be engendered. Nswaste is the daughter of Ecuadorian immigrants who arrived in New York City in 1973. Her work resonates with both her Catholic heritage and Quechua indigenous religion, both in terms of popular piety and institutional practice. For example, she talks about invoking the spirit of the Apus, or the protective spirits of the Andes, and through them, the landscape of Ecuador is translated into her work. She writes, next slide, please. I think. Oh, sorry, you can go back. I guess I don't have the quote, but we can just listen to it. And Swaste says, the Apus are who I acknowledge when I ride my bike across the Oakland Hills, when I take the ferry across the river or swim in the cold ocean. Those spirits are everywhere, in the cracks of the sidewalk where weeds push through the cement, in the lichen of a tree that has fallen. Gestures, whether they are made with my hands, my body, or a tool, create a line in space that connects heart, mind, and the physical environment. End of quote. In Swaste's objects, fragments of wool, fragments of moss, water collected in a jar, a fragment of a sacred spring, all recall an Ecuadorian landscape of trauma and healing. Placing them on a former prison transport bus parked on San Pablo Avenue in Berkeley is a radical gesture in and of itself. She acknowledges that while the formal elements of her work draw interest, it is her Latinx, Ecuadorian, and Christians who can interpret many of the more specific cultural references. To contextualize this practice within the critical framework I've posited here, communitas, as enacted through objects, breaks in through the interstices of structure, in liminality, at the edges of structure, in marginality, and from beneath structure and inferiority, to quote Turner. It is almost everywhere held to be sacred or holy. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then just briefly, I want to turn to Chiara Ambrosio's As Far as the Eye Can Travel project, which comprises a series of handheld and completely handmade zines, which I want to bring into dialogue with in Swaste's work. Each one has a specific theme and contains photography and drawings. The objects are interactive and cinematic. One page is a panoramic landscape. The next is an intimate portrait, vicariously carrying the viewer from Coney Island to Palermo. The title itself invokes the medieval idea of surrogate pilgrimage through manuscripts, maps, and labyrinths, and theories of vision as put forth by, for example, Hugh and Richard of St. Victor, in which the eye becomes the site of an expansive cycle of vision, and their writings on the use of visual aids as a way to facilitate mystic experience. The act of seeing takes on a tactile dimension. The eye can touch and travel. Next slide, please. And here I'm just showing how tiny these little objects are in comparison to some miniature books at the University of Oxford. Then we can go to the next slide, please. Issue number 26, Napoli 18, begins with an augury into the landscape as we follow a figure's gaze out the window. Suddenly, we are on the street looking at a pile of debris, which juxtaposes plywood cupboards with an empty sculptural niche. Day turns to night, and we look up at the rooftops and down onto a roadside Marian shrine. Next slide, please. So this is the next page. It's an icon of Maria della Strada, a lady of the way, affixed to the wall, and underneath is an altarcito of photographs and flower offerings, red roses for Mary. We are reminded of the taxicab altars that Swaste nods to in her bus installation. Ambrosio told me in a recent interview, and I think I have her quote on the next slide, please. Ambrosio told me in a recent interview that these paper Wunderkammer offer a way to challenge mainstream narratives, suggesting that meaningful and transformative events happen often unnoticed, and that through the act of paying attention to what is seemingly marginal, real change and revelation can occur. They are an active commitment to the mystery of presence, a search for continuity within the cracks and the margins. Ambrosio draws inspiration from the works of the neo-surrealist Czech filmmaker Jan Švankmajer and invokes his writings as she describes the talismanic and imbued quality of the zines. Like Foster Campbell's discussion of the protective qualities of the collected medieval pilgrimage badges, Ambrosio writes, this is the next slide, please. She writes, the material world is extremely charged for me, and objects, surfaces, landscapes, to say it with Švankmajer, carry layers of history that have gathered with them through space and time, and that await our touch to be released. With regards to As Far as the Eye Can Travel, the zines are handmade talismans, amulets, and portals, inside which the captured images are given to the paper, transformed into charged objects. Although Ambrosio emphasizes the collective subconscious at work in what she sees as a universal reenchantment of artistic production, she admits that her love of charged architectures and spaces of ritual recalls a childhood in the syncretic culture of Calabria and Rome, The Catholic popular piety is one of tactility and expression. Her feature-length film, The Ghost Frequency, explores a forgotten village in the mountains in the south of Italy and the fragments within, catacombs, embodied devotional practice, and the presence of the dead, an exploration of communitas through filmic space. It is a religious culture saturated with incorrupt bodies visited for blessings. It is quite normal for a devotee to press a prayer card to the glass tomb of a saint, or to create a third-class relic that carries a trace of the blessing of the holy body, itself a channel to the divine. With a bit of imagination, a parallel can be made here with the phenomenological capacity of light and shadow. Perhaps a trace of a person remains embedded in the photographic image. After all, they were touched by the light of the flash, with the image passing through the aperture, transferred or translated to film, and fixed with silver nitrate. There is a relationship here to the Catechism of Trent, which discusses the efficacy of the, quote, shadows of the saints as channels to the divine. Photography is, in its essence, a medium of light and shadow. This notion has been secularized starting around the Reformation, building steam in the 1830s in England and entering critical discourse through, of course, Walter Benjamin's influential theorization of the loss of the aura. What Ambrosio is doing, and as far as the eye can travel, is intentionally exploring this idea of presence through photography embedded in these handheld books. Take, for example, the votive objects in Napoli 16. There is also a relationship to illuminated psalters and pilgrimage badges in their size, scale, and portability. Like the devotional books, they invite both artist and viewer into a shared experience of communitas. Slide, please. Great. Ambrosio discusses her commitment to the shaping of matter and investing the matter with faith, a shared experience that eventually is presented before witness, end quote. The project is, as she describes in a recent interview, a way to talk about transcendence, to translate the mystifying and often unspeakable revelations that occur in those fleeting moments of deep connection with place, a person or object, what holds onto you and hurtles you towards a much wider history than your own singular one, end quote. And then next slide, and I'm just wrapping up here. Great. In issue 3, Ambrosio explores a botanica in East Harlem, the result of a chance encounter with the owner, Jorge Vargas, a spiritual healer in his community. Jorge died before she had a chance to share the finished scene, but she was able to show his wife and daughter, who propped the centerfold of Jorge on the counter on which he was depicted. The zine itself became a portable altarcito, like the dashboard of Insuaste's bus, a site of communitas, an invitation to a voyage where the spirit of Jorge was made present. And I think on the next slide, there's a picture of Jorge in the centerfold. Yeah, so as Victor and Edith Turner note that pilgrimage sites function as a ritualized reenactment of correspondences between a religious paradigm and shared human experience, what I'm arguing here and what has been shown in medieval studies is that objects can do the same. Both artists are pilgrims, collecting objects from sacred sites and curating them into these assemblages, all the while seeking to engender an experience of sacredness for the viewer. The ritual context that undergirds these works allows the framework to work and hopefully brings us closer to developing a critical lexicon to talk about the efficacy of religious objects in contemporary art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for your presentation. This was truly fascinating and really definitely felt close to home as an Italian who grew up in the Roman Catholic Church. But anyhow, just a reminder, everybody, please feel free to keep dropping your questions for the Q&A that we will have shortly. And now I'm happy to introduce our last presenter, Natasha Bissonauth. She is assistant professor at the College of Wooster in Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies. She currently teaches in the Art History Department at York University in Toronto, Canada. Her research examines queer and feminist visual cultures from South Asia and its diaspora. Other research interests include indenture studies and speculative aesthetics. And Natasha's presentation today is titled Queer Collage, Queer Memory, Chitra Ganesh, Tales of Amnesia. Thank you, Natasha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you to the GRI, to Rose and Thisbe especially for the invitation to speak about Chitra Ganesh's digital collages. I've been researching and thinking alongside Chitra Ganesh's work for some 14 years now, because I've been drawn to her research-oriented art-making process, honing in on the work of contemporary artists of color, predominantly from the South Asian diaspora, broadly conceived. I consider how aesthetic strategies, in this case, collage, animate the fragmentary and iconoclastic edge of minoritarian aesthetic practice as a reflection of minoritarian encounters within the archive. Ganesh's corpus is, of course, quite vast, and so I'll focus on a single work of art titled Tales of Amnesia from 2002, an important point of departure some 20 years ago for understanding how archival returns in her artistic practice have mobilized mythological imagery to demythologize violent epistemologies and narratives. Next slide, please. So Tales of Amnesia is an art piece in the form of a zine that Ganesh made in residency at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. In 2002, South Asian artists were emerging amidst the global turn, a period from late 1980s onward, that has been historicized as a time when the art world became captivated by representational capture for the way it could contain and market difference. And I, however, would like to attend to the fragments and less seamless moments during this period, because in 2002, the South Asian diaspora was developing a political voice that extended beyond cultural preservation and beyond the multicultural trap of visibility. In major cities like New York, artists and activists came together in fostering a critique of unquestioned nostalgic ties to the nation. Furthermore, in a newly post 9/11 world that criminalized Muslims as terrorists to justify US imperialist foreign policy, but that also aligned with a Hindu nationalist agenda, it was important to build solidarity as South Asians, which meant taking a political stand against multiple forms of authoritarianism. 2002 is also the year that Chief Minister of the Indian province of Gujarat at the time, Narendra Modi, who is currently India's Prime Minister, but in 2002, he's the Chief Minister of Gujarat. He's making headlines for initiating and condoning the anti-Muslim violence of during that year in Gujarat, which resulted in 2,000 murdered, more injured, more raped, some 150,000 were displaced, many to relief camps, given the scale of property damage. And Modi is a lifelong member of RRS, a paramilitary fundamentalist organization devoted to Hindu nationalist state rule by disenfranchising minority groups such as Muslims and Dalits or oppressed caste. And their Aryan definitions of Hindutva or Hindu-ness resonate with Nazi notions of racial purity and racial pride through purge. This is the context in which Tales of Amnesia emerges, an art zine that is in intentional dialogue with an object that memorializes the nation. Next slide, please. This object in question is ACK, or Amar Chutta Katha, which translates to immortal picture stories. And I'm just going to refer to Amar Chutta Katha as ACK moving forward. So you can see how the art zine here is an intentional dialogue with ACK. These comic books that recount Hindu myth as nationalist propaganda and nationalist propaganda as religious fundamentalist myth. Next slide. So here are just some more examples of cover pages from ACK, the comic book series. Next slide. Just some more documentation. Next slide, please. So in addition to engaging in image and text relations that pervert the conventions of comic books and that are more akin to surrealist automatic writing, Tales of Amnesia is composed largely of digital collages and drawings. And these aesthetic fragments and aesthetic ruptures, the troubled diasporic connections to the National Archive, do so through queer irreverent form that rethinks historical method and narrative alignments. Trained in art semiotics at Brown University prior to her MFA at Columbia University, Ganesh's characteristic style of drawing troubles ideological underpinnings of mythological iconography, the feminine in particular. And this is significant because the Hindu goddess figure has been historically folded into nationalist discourse in India. Next slide, please. And this ideological construction of the Hindu goddess as an allegory for nationhood is well documented, not to mention its heteropatriarchal formations of the feminine. Next slide, please. Given mass production and distribution, a popular source that evidences this confluence between this specific kind of femininity and Hindu nationalism is the ongoing comic book series Amar Shitla Katha. Next slide, please. So first published in 1967, ACK constructs national heroes, then mythologizes them in service of Hindu propaganda. And one way comic books achieve this is by rendering the narration of Hindu myth indistinguishable from Indian history. Within this Hindu nationalist imaginary of ACK, the women fit a predictable mold. Again and again, ACK engenders the same demure, obedient, saintly archetypes, which are not coincidentally also available for sexual consumption. And these archetypes embody virtues like wifely devotion, so firmly held within the unquestioned throes of compulsory heterosexuality. That's Adrienne Rich. Further, ACK presents these long-suffering or self-sacrificing characters as aspirational ideals for its mostly young readership. Next slide. So here's a frame from within the pages of the comic book. So if and when fiercer embodiments of the goddess are invoked, for example, here we see Durga, the goddess Durga, she isn't necessarily framed as the unconsorted warrior that she is, but as an instrument for the male gods here. In this instance, they've summoned her for battle. And I'm going to return to this image shortly. Ganesh, next slide, please. Ganesh grew up reading these comic books, these ACK comic books in the 1970s and the 1980s, when there was a dearth of images that did not refer to the subcontinent as disaster-stricken. ACK's strategic distribution within the diaspora offered a counterpoint, a root to your roots, if you will. And this phrase, root to your roots, is commonly used to describe the comics and resonates in particular with the diaspora, not only as a nostalgic link to the homeland, but as an enactment of national pride within an otherwise hostile and xenophobic host nation, in this case, the US. However, through queer collage, digital drawing, and an aberration of image and text relations, Ganesh's archival returns trouble such diasporic longing and ultimately interrogate rather than affirms diasporic connection to the homeland. Through irreverent form, erotically charged juxtapositions, she ruptures ACK's easy-to-read format, a nationalist, heteropatriarchal, and moralizing project that has been so easily sublimated through children's literature. On the one hand, Tales of Amnesia is based on a symbiotic relationship with ACK, using characteristic style and visual language. So you can see here the economic line and color compared to ACK. On the other hand, it's a 24, here we have, it's 24 pages of disparate panels, involve digitally manipulated collage and original drawing and text that intentionally undermine and sever from the source material's narrative and iconography to queer parodic measure in many instances. Slide, please. So if you recall this frame from the pages of ACK, where the goddess appears to emerge out of the collective vision and will of the gods, the warrior goddess is transformed in Tales of Amnesia. Slide, please. So in a world without men, her headless, disrobed, self-pleasuring body becomes centerfold. Ganesh revels in gratuitousness, undermining the heteropatriarchal nationalism embedded in ACK's retelling of myth, and her queer collages cut dramatically from ACK's propagandistic intentions. And if we zoom in into the violent splicing of her curious, surreal beheading, exposing blood and bone, the warrior goddess comes to embody the inherent violence but insurrectional promise of collage. Indeed, Tales of Amnesia, throughout Tales of Amnesia, femme erotics, as combined with violence, recur. Slide, please. So consider here, this following image, a disturbing kind of imbrication between lesbian desire and sati, that the very controversial practice of widow burning upon the death of a husband to be considered a quote unquote honorable option. So on the one hand, we see a tender, sexually charged scene within close quarters that encase their locked gaze and fondled exposed breasts. But on the other hand, the accompanying text that reads, quote, "When they cremated you, did your teeth dissolve in the fire?" provides a jarring juxtaposition. This dissonance between image and text in Ganesh's queer collages sutures elements that do not fit, enacting a cacophony that resonates as an ominous cautionary tale. The proximity of queer desire and gender-based violence in this frame reflects the zine's most evident and most provoking interventions. So close, we could say they themselves erotically touch. Ganesh's archival returns suggests a queer relationship to the archive by touching the past differently, bringing in pleasure to weigh in on the violent processes of historical consciousness. This is what Elizabeth Freeman terms erotohistoriography, which here disrupts queer diasporic attachment to home, nation, and the archive. Slide, please. In one last frame from Tales of Amnesia, Ganesh perverts the story of Mirabai, a 16th century mystic poet and bhakti saint who devotes her life to the god Krishna and to divine song. Slide, please. So in ACK, so this is a page from ACK. And so here we have, so Mirabai is 5 years old in this particular frame, and her mother suggests that she pray to Krishna with the devotion akin to the bonds of marriage. A suggestion that Mirabai interprets literally. And this part of the story is an integral aspect of Mirabai's sanctification process. Slide, please. So Ganesh picks this scene apart in her version. So you can see how she leaves the blue geometric background in place and manipulates the characters either through doubling or disappearance. Instead of the mother guiding Mirabai to her beloved Krishna, Ganesh doubles the young girl and flips the image around. And so the results being these twins are encouraged to lock in a queer incestuous kiss. And additionally, Ganesh dissolves the presence of Krishna into a kind of quote unquote strange presence, just to pull from the text box here. The peacock feathers, as peacock feathers in a frenzied flitter occupy the space where the revered Krishna once stood, once again, Ganesh foregrounds femme perversity in a world without men. Ganesh's goddesses are not docile or passive objects, as in ACK's Orientalist dream worlds or nationalist imaginaries, but distorts and severs from the dangers of such fantasies. Between masturbating goddesses and incestuous twins, Tales of Amnesia turns to radical manipulation to clear ground for not simply alternative narratives, but another sense of time. Thinking alongside queer scholarship on temporality, Tales of Amnesia queers memory, fostering forms of unknowing that resist and undercut grand logics of recall, alongside the authority of teleological historical inquiry. Tales of Amnesia is a call to remember otherwise. In 2002, when Ganesh was revisiting ACK for the first time since her childhood, in the midst of a newly post-9/11 world, in the midst of Modi's pogroms in India, and as South Asian artists were developing a political platform in the diaspora in an unprecedented way, she couldn't help but read these comic books anew, read these comic books otherwise. Ultimately, and this is my last point, Ganesh's zine animates the most basic and fundamental praxis of visual literacy and its unlikely seam with iconoclasm. Her queer collages incite not only the political import of reading images, but the stakes of reading through images. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And I would ask now all of the speakers to turn on their camera, their mic, so we can start the Q&A. We have about 25 minutes. We got several questions already, but I like to start with one general comment that I hope can trigger some brief remarks from all of you. And in the meanwhile, please keep on posting your questions. Your presentation said the whole idea of the fragment transformed made me think about Linda Nocklin's The Body in Pieces and her analysis of the use of the fragment, and particularly in her case of severe body parts in visual production during the French Revolution. Her point being that whereas the fragment would usually displace the idea of totality into the past or into a distant future, and thus eliciting nostalgia or utopian thinking, in revolutionary times, the fragment signals and enacts the deliberate destruction of the past and the rebuilding of a new future. And I feel like in different ways, you all seem to point to notions such as trauma, healing, remembering otherwise, remaking and reprogram society. So I'd like basically to bring up the question of time and ask you to elaborate on what kind of temporality is entailed and performed by the use of fragments in your case study. I don't know who wants to start or have any ideas. Anybody?
I have not read that essay. However, I think, thinking about the Purifoy's work, in which there are these fragments that have these sort of he talks about these like multiple historical trajectories of fragments that are from the immediate events of the rebellion, from this like sort of longer history of capitalist undevelopment, as the Boggses put it. Then we have the sort of the revolutionary time, I guess, of the 1960s, and and sort of this I mean, I feel like with the Purifoy materials, it's quite contradictory in the sense that for the Boggses, right, they want this sort of immediate revolution to the extent that it's possible. Purifoy is perhaps, more concerned with like process, like, so there's a little bit different relation to time. But I think that, for that like moment when especially bringing the Boggs in maybe versus, and again, I haven't read the essay, but what you were talking about is that there's this like sense, right, that of, time as being this, right, the sort of the sense of capitalist like linear time, right, that that I think both of them in some sense like want to get out of time, maybe not in the same sense, because I know I don't know, it's a good question, right, because I think they have a very ambivalent relationship to like time, and that they want to inhabit a different time, right? But what does that mean in terms of moving forward and, the relationship to the past, right? There's something like a little bit more ambiguous about it, even though it's supposed to be this moment of revolutionary transformation, right? That there's something like, I don't know, in between perhaps as well. Now, I also think like Purifoy, one of the questions that I saw in the box had to do with the Joshua tree, the Bessemer steel, and right, and those like works in the 90s and early 2000s before he died are partly supposed to be about that they're supposed to weather and transform. And so with Purifoy too, you have the other time of like geology and like the planet, which is like much longer, and so there's this there's multiple times happening at once. And so I think, right, there's this sort of ambiguity about the place of time there, perhaps. I don't know, just thinking out loud.
And Catherine, I think, of course, in your presentation, the question of memory is very present. And we have one question actually, and I'll just read it aloud. Can you elaborate on how the pieces in the pilgrimage assemblages are artifacts of human memory? Are they contact relics, trophies? Do the individual stories of the pieces melt into the assemblage?
Thanks. That's a great question, Pietro, and it dovetails with the question that you just asked as well, I think. And I would say that all the sites examined are they were both sacred in kind of pre-Christian times, and there's a syncretism as they were overlaid with Christianity, and in that way there's a syncretic overlay of tradition and belief that crosses time. And if you look at the altar citone and Suaste's bust, for example, it draws from a landscape that's imbued with both the trauma of both trauma and the healing. So it's been kind of reclaimed by going to these sacred sites, finding the water and installing them on a bus as a specific memorial to a person, in that case, her parents who had immigrated from Ecuador in the 70s.
We also had an interesting question that just came for both of you, actually, Catherine and Natasha, but maybe Natasha, you can start, which is about the medium of the zine itself. Is there something inherently fragmentary about the zine as a fragile, ephemeral form of publication that circulates in underground networks? Do you want to elaborate on that, Natasha?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think with this zine in particular, what makes the zine fragmentary is definitely its narrative logic and the ways that the text has this kind of, it's sort of written out as sort of surreal automatic writing. And so there isn't a logical relationship to the images that we see. And certainly zines in general have this kind of precarious, ephemeral quality. And so, conducting a kind of history of zine would likely involve a fragmented archive. What's interesting about this particular zine, because it is technically an art piece in the form of a zine, and so there's been actually a lot of care taken to preserving this piece by museums, by galleries, by collectors. And so it's, and I've been asked question I've been asked about. It's zine, this artwork's zine form, and how does the work circulate? The work circulates like a work of art, and so shows in museums and galleries and is part of private collections, which is not which is not this trajectory, the social life of actual zines. And so I've always thought that that's sort of an interesting aspect of the work. The work is meant to bring conversations about ephemera, about the way that zines do, within the art world context. But yeah, I would say as far as the fragment is concerned, this zine in particular feels fragmentary, of course, in the ways that I've talked about collage, but especially in from page to page to page, the narrative that we're all sort of looking for or seeking does not happen, does not deliver.
Catherine, do you have any more thoughts on the medium of the zine in the case study you presented?
Yeah, well, I think Ambrosio's for the time being is a subscription, actually. So it definitely does have this kind of feel of underground circulation. It's not, she does have feature-length films that have been shown to public audiences and have won public awards and things like that. But the zines they do feel a bit secret because it comes in the mail and it's in this like beautiful kind of ephemeral glassine paper, and then you pull out the zine and they're really small, but only in physical size, because they really do become these portals. And I think this kind of relates to what Brian was saying about the sort of extra temporality of these objects, because for her it's about that kind of transfer from a thing or a site that's perceived as sacred onto the filmic space, and then into this little kind of tiny fragmentary zine. So you're getting a fragment of what's kind of a longer, for her, like a longer pilgrimage, a continuing journey. And so these little objects kind of continue to work as the viewer proceeds through the pages. And like what Natasha was saying, I think in Ambrosio's work too, there's not necessarily a narrative per se. Time is kind of folding back on itself, and they're cinematic in the sense that it's more about kind of like widening the aperture and then narrowing in, and that starts to kind of tell the story through these very kind of cinematic but still images.
Great, thank you. So Brian, back to you. We do have a couple of questions that kind of brings the Watts uprising closer to our today, the situation of we are living today. Somebody's asking, can the junk of 65 be compared with the materials from the fallen Twin Towers of 2001? And Cherie Smith is asking, what are your thoughts on Colleen Smith's recent engagement with Purifoy in her exhibition now on view at LACMA? Do you want to elaborate on any of those?
Sorry, the second one, I have to admit that I did go see that. However, it was I went to see it the first weekend that it opened. The first thing that I'd done indoors since COVID happened, and I really need to go back and see the exhibition. Thank you actually for the question to trigger me to go back. I remember the desert. I believe there was sort of videos of the desert, and then some sculpture, some found objects. So I'm trying to put it back together in my head. I love in the chat box to hear from the person asking the question what they think about that relationship. But basically, thank you for reminding me that I need to go back and see it again. In terms of the first question, it hasn't crossed my mind before. I would. Off the top of my head, I would say that I don't really see much of a relationship in the sense that the Watts Rebellion, Martin Luther King, right after he died, a book of his was published that was supposed to be leading up to the Poor People's Campaign that was going to happen in Washington, D.C. He starts off his sort of reflections on the ways in. So Watts becomes this sort of like moment, the rebellion in which triggers a lot of rethinking for certain people, both in the 60s as well, like later on, about the way in which it's this moment of sort of like, it's this major crisis in like the Keynesian like state project or whatever, right? That you know, is often can be seen as sort of like foreshadowing the you know, structural changes of the 1970s and neoliberalism and these things. And Martin Luther King sort of treats that in this a similar way. In 1968, when he's writing this book and looking back at how he visited, and he was received like very like poorly by kids in Watts in particular, and how there was like lots of sort of like trauma around the events, right? But there is also all these kids who are like, hey, we got the world's attention, like everybody ignores us, like nobody cares about us. And so there's both this sort of, you know, there is like trauma, but from a certain group of people, there's like celebration, right? And then there's also what comes out of it is Purifoy's work is first shown, the 66 Signs of Neon exhibition is first shown as part of the Watts Summer Festival, which is put on in the next year. And then it starts to travel around. And then, I mean, there's a movie from, I think it's 1972 of the Watts Summer Festival that Richard Pryor hosts, right? In this huge event that has to be moved into like the Coliseum. And so I think there's lots of contradictions around the event, but part of it is certainly putting together all of these like festivals and kids. Oh, it drew attention to like our struggle that's previously being ignored. And so the materials that are made out of it, I think, have both this, right, this, as Kelly Jones has talked about, that Sir Watts is a figure in need of care, right? But there's also all of this, you know, community art that comes out of it. And I'm not sure that with 9/11, there's the same sense of, you know, I mean, ultimately the United States has killed millions of people, like as a result of this thing, right? Or, I mean, as you know, lots of people got sick and died who were frontline workers, and there's lots of, I feel like there's, I don't know if there's much to recoup like of celebration out of 9/11 in the ways that there's all of this art that comes out of, you know, that's like sort of positive. About the Watts Rebellion. Not to say that it was all great or whatever, right? But there's these possibilities that come out of it that feel absent to me from 9/11. But it's never really occurred to me to think about them together.
Yeah, thank you. We still have questions coming in, and there's one for Natasha, and I will read it from Sushma Griffin. Natasha, please, could you comment on the contemporary reception of the multi-temporalities of the mythologies in the ACK, in particular the co-ebalness, I'm not sure what they mean there, but of the mythologies with Chitra Ganesh art scenes? Have ACK representations changed in any way to be more representative of the contemporary condition of the Indian public in the 2020s?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that question, and I'm definitely thinking of Chitra Ganesh's engagement with ACK, and so it's this kind of engagement with her childhood experience ultimately, right? And so the publications from the 70s, let's say. And, you know, there are definitely different periods that are, you know, more nationalist than others. And these kind of overlap with the political, you know, the ACK is very much in cahoots with you know, maintaining the status quo. And so I would say, you know, there are certainly, you know, I don't want to say that that there's no sort of shift in some of the narrative, you know. So for example, maybe more contemporary comic books will have a book on like women in science, for example. And so that would be a new development, certainly from the 1970s, but there's still this frame, this kind of respectability politics that's going to be maintained. That these, I think what has been consistent is the ways in which these comic books, these children's comic books, certainly align with the political status quo.
Thank you for that. There's another question for Brian from Sonia de la Forcade. I was struck by the emphasis on figure ground composition in the 66 Signs of Neon poster, which seems to emphasize the integrity of Purifoy's sculpture as a cohesive whole. Could you speak more to this tension between the fragment and the whole in Purifoy's work? How might that relate to the turn to the value of man as you describe it in your talk? And maybe this question of figure and ground and fragment and whole, we can open it up also to Catherine, if you have something to say about that, for example, in the altar installation you analyzed.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The question of value and transformation, Purifoy, and I don't know, I feel like it relates in some sense, though it seems quite differently to there's a question about education and STEM education. Purifoy was he was a social worker before he became an artist. Well, he was also before he did junk sculpture. He did modernist interior design, but he was a social worker, and eventually joined the California Council for the Arts, one of its founding members in the 70s. And primarily talked about arts education, like that was his thing. And so I like that image because of this relationship between that the question is referring to. But I think for Purifoy, the question of the fragment and the final whole, there's ambivalence there, because when he talks about his work, he almost ever only talks about it in terms of the creative process. He only the process of putting it together, that you're going to create these alternative circumstances, you're going to get people to look at to put this work together, and it's going to change who they are. The viewer looking at them is going to be transformed as they sort of look at these various fragments and put them together for themselves. And so I think that the question of the whole is ambivalent in a couple. One, because he's primarily interested in process, and that's all he really wants to. That's primarily just what he talks about. And then the fact that the commodity, they're funny because they're these, when people talk about them a lot, they're these objects that were destroyed, damaged during the rebellion, that they're former commodities, that they're given alternative value from their sort of commodity value by giving use value, and their transformation as part of this process and this thing. But then the 66 Signs pieces, which were only some of them were his, it's a multi-artist exhibition. It's just he was the theorist and organizer behind it. They were sold, so they are art objects in the traditional sense. That they're but for him, it's the process versus then he quits making art for a long time, and when he's working out in the desert, it again becomes about the transformative process of these materials. So I think that the relationship between the final product and the fragment is interesting because of what seems to me to be his ambivalence around it, because he's mostly focused on the practice and not what happens to these things. I mean, he threw them away at the end as well, which I think says something about the fact that he talked a lot about, he was I could have made a lot of money doing modernist interior design, but I didn't want to do that anymore. I want to be poor and just do these art projects with kids. And so yeah, it's a good question. I think that his focus on process further problematized.
Thank you. Catherine, do you want to briefly touch on the topic of the whole, maybe in the altar installation, or in the idea of the relic?
Sure, yeah. So I took, as you could tell from the talk, I took a sort of longue durée approach, and I was putting these things into their sort of medieval context and how that's still playing out today. So there's kind of a theological impetus to some of this work. And in the Middle Ages, a lot of people couldn't go on long journeys physically to sacred sites because of tenure to the land or economic hardship, or as we're facing today in this time of pandemic, ill health. So there's been a long tradition of kind of vicarious embodied travel through by transferring kind of a sacred site to a smaller site. So you have, as I showed, the little pilgrimage badges that are sewn onto the pages of medieval manuscripts as kind of an extrasensory, multifaceted devotional experience where there's a tactility of the finger, but also a tactility of the eye. You know, as Hugh and Richard of St. Victor theorized, there's like a sight was connected to touch. So I think with these two artists' work, and Pietro, you mentioned the altar sito in particular, what Gisela is doing is she's kind of taking things from her home of Ecuador and then transferring them to the altar sito to create this kind of, to engender an embodied experience for the people that come onto the bus and make tactile contact with the altar. People are invited to do so. And the objects have scents. They smell, you know, they have like a fragrance and odor. It's a really extrasensory experience because she's gone to Ecuador, to her ancestral Quechua land, like gathered fragments of wool, dyed them and imbued them, and then in a kind of ritual process has installed them onto this altar sito. So it's really supposed to bring this landscape of Ecuador, which is for her, in her Quechua belief, she talked about the apus, who are kind of the nature spirits that that are part of the landscape, and taking that and putting it on the altar sito so that other people can have a sort of embodied experience as they encounter that specific installation. So anyway, the fragments therefore kind of create a whole because they're meant to be transportative, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay, all right. Well, this is all the time we have for questions. It's already noon. So I just want to thank all the speakers and thank you all in the audience for your participation in an enlightening and interesting discussion today. The panel will be soon available on YouTube, and we will continue hosting panels on the theme of the fragment throughout the scholar year. So please stay tuned to hear about the next section. And thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.